Okay, this is Bierregaard. Greetings to the Hog Island Osprey fans. I'm an old friend with some of you. I've even met some at the Hog Island Nature Camp where I teach the Rapture session for Audubon in mid-July. For those of you who don't know me, I've been studying ospreys since 1971 when I climbed into my first osprey nest up on Martha's Vineyard. I've always been fascinated by birds of prey, and ospreys have a very special place in my heart, as many of you know. I've been tracking the osprey population on Martha's Vineyard since the late 1990s, and since the year 2000 I've been putting satellite tracking devices, small radios that ospreys wear in a little backpack. And once I release them with their little backpack, I can sit at my computer, and their information from the birds is fed into my website, ospreytracks.com. That's T-R-A-X. I'm sure we'll provide a link for that. So I've been studying osprey migration mostly in New England, but I've tagged birds as far south as South Carolina and as far north as northern New Hampshire. So I've got questions here that are being forwarded to me. I'll see if I can begin answering questions while we track the fine-tuning the audio and video feed. So the first question is a good one, all about migration, which I've been studying for almost 17 years now. So the question is, once the chicks are grown, do they migrate back with Rachel and Steve, or do they go their separate ways? Do they ever return to this site, as this is where they migrated from, or do they go elsewhere to prevent inbreeding? Very good question. The chicks do not migrate with their parents. That happens in some birds, but in birds of prey, the adults go their separate ways, and the offspring. Everybody's on their own once they leave the nest. Typically, they just go when they're ready. The fascinating things I've been following with my research, which is concentrated a lot on tracking juvenile birds on their first migration south. So they go south, they find their way to down mostly into South America, about 90 to 95 or 18 months. Young ospreys spend Florida, wherever they spend their first non-breeding season. When they come back, the females will tend to wander, and they don't tend to come back as close to their original nest site as do the males. Males rarely nest more than about 15 miles from where they were born, and as the questioner astutely observed, that is a method of preventing inbreeding. Okay, seems like we're back, and I guess the transmission has improved. So our second question is all about the chick's vision. When did they start to develop their osprey vision? This is a part of their biology I don't know a whole lot about, and I think based on what you all are watching on the webcams, you probably know as much about this about this than I do. Certainly the vision takes a while to develop. I think maybe within a week or so they're probably are looking at the world in pretty much in high resolution, if you will. So don't have a lot of specifics on that answer. This morning it appeared that two of the chicks were fighting, grabbing for food in the general direction of movement, and each thought the other bird's beak was a bite. Are they really scrabbling like siblings, or is this a dominance thing, or is the other chick's beak or head just in the way? Osprey young do set up a hierarchy, a dominance hierarchy, literally a pecking order, and this may begin pretty early on. So the first hatched young will often maintain a position of dominance over the other young. And this, along with the staggered hatching, I noticed this year that the first two eggs hatched on the same day. Often the first egg will hatch a day or two before the second egg, and that may be 3 or 4 days, as much as 3 or 4 days before the third egg hatches. And that is all set up so that if food is short, is limited, the fishing isn't good, and there's not enough food being brought into the nest to raise 3 young, let's say there's only enough to raise 1, the first young, the dominant one, usually the first hatched, will get all the food first. And if there's not enough to go around between his 2 siblings, the 2 siblings will starve. And that's it's harsh, but that's the way it works. And when you think about it, if there were the 3 young were all equally capable of getting food, then enough fish for 1 young would be divided between 3 young, and none of them would survive. So that squabbling really is the beginning of a dominance hierarchy. If there's lots of food being brought to the nest, everything will be fine. The 3rd young, the least dominant bird, will just be fed last, but it should get enough food to fledge. Someone has asked, notice that the babies early on take a bite from mom and then just keel over like a food coma has taken over them, then pop up with renewed energy. Do the chicks really get instant energy from their food? They can't digest and metabolize the food that fast, so that may be just a brief resting period when they, just the very small young, just the process of raising their head up to take a bite of food is energetically demanding, and they may just sort of plop down and sort of catch their wind and pop up for the next bite, but they're not getting it that fast from the food. Do raptors have gizzards, or does the fish literally melt in their mouths? Raptors don't have gizzards like chickens and granivorous birds do. If you've looked at your chicken giblets, you'll see that big muscular round thing is the chicken's gizzards, and chickens need that to grind soft flesh, which they don't need to grind up, so they don't have a muscular gizzard. The food is swallowed down and it goes into a glandular portion of the stomach. It goes into the crop. You can see when the young birds have been just taking a big meal, it looks like they swallowed a small tennis ball. So that's the food that's in the crop, which is slowly being digested, and then the liquid, the food that's been digested passes into the small intestines, and then the indigestible parts, the fish scales and bones, will get cast up, regurgitated, and those are the raptor pellets that many of you have dissected in school, or your kids have. So, next question. Rachel and Steve seem to be following a pattern with respect to hatchings. Every other year there has been 1 out of the 3 eggs that does not hatch. Do ospreys ordinarily experience off years after successful ones? Probably not. It's hard to say what exactly that's all about. It may simply be if an egg isn't hatching, 1 of the 3 doesn't hatch. It's most likely has something to do with weather during incubation. Is my best bet. There's nothing they can do in terms of the egg. Possible that an egg wasn't fertilized, so that may be what happened. So either the egg wasn't fertilized, or there was something that it didn't get incubated well. It's hard exactly to say what might cause that. Internet resources about ospreys note that the male and female both develop a brood patch. You were quoted in the Chesapeake blog as saying they do not. I have seen no evidence of one on either parent. Can you inform us further about this? Well, I've handled a lot of ospreys, and I've never seen a brood patch. And this gets back to the questions about the incubation, and particularly the long incubation period. Osprey eggs, as you all know very well, take somewhere between 36 and 39, as many as 40 days to hatch, which is a very long period for a bird of prey the size of an osprey. That's a long time. A red-tailed hawk egg would probably hatch in about 30 or 31 days, and in fact a bald eagle egg hatches in about 38 days. So it's always been a bit of a mystery why osprey eggs take so long to hatch. And I've thought about this, and especially after handling so many female ospreys around breeding time, And I notice they don't have a brood patch, and in fact their body feathers are very short. So there's not, and there's a very thin down layer. So typically birds, more typical raptors have fairly long downy or contour feathers which they can fluff out, and they've got a thick down layer, so they can really, it's like taking a down-filled parka and wrapping it around their eggs when a bird is incubating eggs with a brood patch. So ospreys don't, as far as I know, don't have brood patches, and certainly the males wouldn't. That would, and combined with the very short contour feathers, means that they just can't get the eggs very warm, and I think that's why it takes the eggs so long to hatch. Can I speak a little bit about female ospreys consuming their eggs, i.e. Audrey down at Chesapeake? Do they know the eggs are non-viable? Could they be consuming for the nutrients to protect the rest of the nest from predators? It's probably a nutrient thing. They don't know when an egg is inviable. They'll just, eggs that don't hatch typically just sort of disappear down into the nest. As you all have seen, the ospreys are continuously bringing material to the nest during the breeding season. And so typically eggs that don't hatch just sort of disappear. The comment here is about the female at the Chesapeake nest with the camera. A great horned owl came in and took one of the young out of that nest, and probably there was one of the eggs that didn't hatch. And the other interesting thing about that is that those eggs had been unattended for about 10 days or so into their incubation period. The female left the nest, the temperature was in the low to mid 40s, and it was cold and rainy, and those eggs were unincubated for something like 7 or 8 hours. And amazingly, those eggs all, 2 of the 3 hatched. So that sort of further feeds into my thoughts about the eggs being adapted to not being very warm, and apparently they can take a pretty long period of chilling as well. So I think what may have happened with Audrey's eggs is that the unhatched egg may have been broken when the owl attacked the nest. And once it was broken, then the female could consume it. And certainly that's a nutrient. She's recycling those nutrients. Someone from coastal South Carolina has seen ospreys every month but February. Is it possible in these warmer climates that they are not migrating or perhaps taking a quick trip to Florida for the coldest months? You may have some birds down there. In coastal South Carolina and even North Carolina, there are ospreys all year round. And some of those birds are probably birds that have migrated from further north, got as far as South Carolina, and said, this is far enough for me. And one of the juveniles I tagged from Delaware migrated just down to Georgia and spent its winter there until I think a great horned owl got it. So there may be birds that just don't migrate from that area, but I think it's more likely that some of those birds are moving a little bit south or all the way to South America, and the birds that you see lingering in coastal South Carolina and Georgia are in fact birds from further north. So we've seen that with satellite track birds, that some of them go down to all the way down to South America. Some of them stop in Florida, some stop in Cuba, and some of the Florida birds are actually, when you get down to sort of the southern half of Florida, you get birds that don't migrate at all. And they may move a little bit away from the nest, but they stay in southern Florida. And strangely enough, there are birds in southern Florida who continue to migrate all the way down to South America, which they certainly don't need to do. Ospreys can close their nostrils when diving into the water. Is this a learned or instinctive response to dive in water? Do they always close their nostrils when diving in the water? I'm sure that's instinctual. I don't know exactly how that works, so can't offer any more information than it must be instinctual. Can ospreys mate and have babies more than once a year? No, is the answer to that one. There's a pair nesting in a cell tower near my house that seem to be on their second phase of nesting for the spring. Sometimes if a nest is disturbed and they lose eggs early on, they might recycle, but the whole process of laying with that long 38-day incubation period and then 8 weeks rather before fledging, that right there is almost more than 3 full months. So if the process is just too long for them to start again, unless they lose eggs really early on. How long will a parent remember the young as their own? That's the question that no one except an osprey knows the answer to. I don't think parents, and this is based on no real information, but when a young osprey comes back after its first migration south, it's not going to look like it did before. It won't have the speckles, the scalloping that we recognize from the young ospreys. So whether there may be some vocal recognition, that's possible, but no one really knows the answer to that question. How big is the Hog Island osprey nest? Are the different items that are brought in, the lichenous sticks, grasses, kelp, are they choices of nutritious value? I've seen the osprey take nips of them. The nest is pretty big. When I was up to band the young 2 summers ago, I got up to the one edge of the nest and I couldn't reach one of the young. I had a hard time reaching one of the young that was on the other side of the nest. So the nest is probably close to 5 feet across. From stick to stick is probably even closer to 6 feet. So at least 5 feet across. The material that's brought in doesn't really have any nutritious value. I'm not sure what the birds are doing when they're taking nips of the lichens and whatnot. They may be just readjusting things. As a specialist on osprey migration, what do you think about this? We noticed that this year many ospreys arrived earlier than in previous years. But both Rachel and Steve not only arrived on the same day, they arrived close to their arrival dates of previous years. What is known about the various triggers for a bird to start its migration trip north? That's a really fascinating question, and one that we don't understand at all. And it's almost mind-boggling that ospreys can do that birds do that in general. And there are some birds that are very predictable about the date that they arrive back in their breeding areas. In fact, there's a vulture festival somewhere in Ohio because the turkey vultures always get back on pretty much the same day. The swallows in Capistrano were famous for always returning on the same day every spring. So what triggers the birds to come north is just a complete mystery to us. Presumably it might be something to do with day length, but since birds are migrating to different parts of South America, and in fact some birds are migrating south of the equator, when the trigger cannot be the fact that the days are getting longer, which is what happens in the spring. That happens, of course, for birds that are wintering north of the equator, but for ospreys that are wintering south of the equator, as the northern spring begins, it's actually fall south of the equator, so days are getting shorter down there. So one thing that may figure into it is some sort of an internal clock. It's almost as if the birds have some kind of a calendar. That we run into the same question on young birds when they're going south. How do they know where to stop? Some birds will, typically young birds, if you just look at their migration days, they'll migrate south for about 30 days, but they can stop for 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a place and then start again. We had one young who got to southern Florida and spent almost 3 weeks there. We thought he was done with migration, and then all of a sudden he got up and migrated all the way down to the Amazon. So that's a real mystery that no one has any clue about, no good data at least. So probably something to do with changes in day length and some combination of that and some sort of an internal clock or calendar. What are your most recent observations about the effects of climate change on osprey habits and habitation? There does seem to be more and more ospreys wintering further and further north. So each year on the Christmas bird counts, we're seeing more and more ospreys around Chesapeake Bay, even up into southern New England. So that may be some birds that are decided they're not going to migrate further south. That might also be birds that are not doing well. And it may be that a certain percentage of ospreys aren't going to migrate very far south each year, and because osprey populations are growing so much, that the increase in the number of ospreys we see along the Carolina coast is not a reaction to climate change, but simply the same percentage of birds each year that are deciding to winter north of Florida, and that percentage is just of a bigger baseline. So that's why we're getting more birds there. Ospreys are extremely flexible about what their habitat and what they eat. So I think if ever a bird is going to be pretty much immune to climate change, it's going to be the osprey. I have to disagree with National Audubon's assessment of osprey as a species vulnerable to climate change. Ospreys nest from the Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle down to the Caribbean, and so certainly they can make it in any climate that we can invent, and they don't really care what kind of fish they're eating, as long as they're eating fish that have some sort of fish that's in the right size range and is near the surface of the water. So I really don't see ospreys as being vulnerable to climate change. Steve is bringing in twice as much fish as he did during the first weeks in previous years. Would there be another explanation for this increased fish amount outside of the fact that the mackerel's running? We've seen mackerel runs before, but 12 to 13 fish a day right after hatching is pretty awesome. I think this is clearly just a factor of what's available, and so if there's a big mackerel run somewhere and Steve has found it, he's going to bring in, the mackerel runs tend to be pretty easy pickings for ospreys, so he's making hay while the sun shines, as it were. This afternoon, Rachel was feeding and suddenly flew off with big alarm calls. The two chicks immediately pancaked. The youngest one looked around like, what just happened? Do we know at what age this sort of survival instinct kicks in? Well, this is the great benefit of osprey cams, is that you guys now are collecting this sort of data. We osprey biologists who go to visit osprey nests periodically to band the young or to tag young for satellite telemetry or to measure them, to measure their growth. We have never, until the age of nest cams, had the opportunity to observe this kind of behavior. So this is one where you guys are the experts on this, and that's really interesting, an interesting observation. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term pancaked, when young ospreys hear their parents give an alarm call, they lie down and they play possum. The first time I went into an osprey nest, to band young, I didn't know about this behavior. I was used to banding red-tailed hawks, and when you get into a red-tailed hawk nest, the young are standing up, their wings are out, and they're ready to grab you with their feet. When you go to an osprey nest, once the young have heard their parents giving alarm calls, they just lie down and play possum, which makes sense because osprey nests are so exposed that they don't want to be standing up and attracting attention, especially when the parents are giving an alarm call. So the ospreys will lie down and play dead, and I remember putting my hand up over the edge of an osprey nest and feeling the young all lying down. I thought they just died. So that's typical behavior, and apparently it's just kicked in with one of the birds and it hasn't with the other. So again, you guys are the experts on this one. Is there any way to avoid the tragedy that Rachel and Steve experienced last year, losing their babies to a predatory bird? I know it's nature, but can we help to protect their nest? So for those who weren't watching last year, a bald eagle or two came in and took both young out of the nest. There's nothing that we can do to protect the nest. It's just this is the kind of thing that's going to happen more and more now that bald eagle populations are increasing. And in fact, across North America, about the only place that osprey populations aren't increasing is where the bald eagle population is really increasing. So that's just something that they're going to have to sort out. We can't do anything about it. Can you please discuss the changes in the nest this year? Were you asked for input regarding the changes? Should the nesting materials be removed at the end of each season? I wasn't consulted. I don't see any need for that. I think the nest was getting a little bit big for its support, so knocking it back was not a bad idea. A lot of nests are blown off their poles every winter, so it's not unusual for ospreys to come back to their regular nesting location and find the nest gone. They just rebuild. That's part of the normal process. The nesting materials don't need to be removed at the end of each season. Obviously, ospreys have evolved for millions of years without humans doing anything to their nests. And there are nests there's a famous nest down on Cape Cod that was at least 6 feet tall. I've seen amazing pictures of that. So some nests will just build up and build up. There's no need for us to do anything other than in the situation where the nest is getting too big for the support platform that's holding it up. Should osprey platforms be designed with short railings to help contain the osprey-built nest and protect it from wind blowing down their constructions? Considering they build round nests, what platform dimensions would you recommend? I don't think square versus round is important. I like the nest platform that I think works really well is taking a gate from a chain link fence and putting that on top of a pole with supports going down from the sides of the gate to the platform. That was an idea I came up with. It's being used in North Carolina and Charlotte around Lake Norman, and it makes a great nest support. It doesn't need anything. You don't need any rims for it. The birds drop sticks into the holes in the chain link fence are big enough that big sturdy sticks can get in there and anchor it. So I think that's all one needs. If you're just putting up a plywood or a flat platform, then having something around the edges to keep the initial sticks in place is a good idea. The best thing when you're putting up a platform is actually to build a nest. Ospreys will be quickly and strongly attracted to new nest platforms that have a nest on them. Doesn't have to be an excellent osprey nest, but the osprey researchers over in Scotland and elsewhere in Great Britain have had great success when they put up a platform with the nest constructed, and they do a complete nest with grassy bowl in it, and ospreys will sometimes land on one of those and start laying eggs in a few days, in just a few days. A quick question, plural, ospreys or osprey? I don't have a real preference on that, and I probably do a mental coin flip when I'm talking about ospreys. I think I probably use ospreys more often than just osprey. Other than bald eagles, are great horned owls, buzzards, and herons also known to take chicks from osprey nests? Also, would any of them attack an adult osprey? Great horned owls certainly attack and kill both young and adult ospreys. I've probably lost 6 or 7 of my adult full-grown ospreys, both juveniles on their first migration and adults on experienced migrating adults. They the sort of symptoms of that are that one of our birds goes into a woodlot and spends the night and doesn't come out the other end, and we go in and find a pile of feathers the next, once we see that the transmitter isn't moving. Buzzards, it's a bit of a tricky term. Over here, by buzzards, we mean vultures. In Europe, buzzards are what we call hawks. So assuming this means vultures, I don't think that vultures are a threat. They might, I suppose, take a young osprey, but our vultures are really tied into dead stuff. So, and I would think that they would be pretty easily driven away by the adult ospreys at a nest. Herons, I suppose, could. Again, a bit tricky with the adult ospreys around. And would any of those attack an adult osprey? Certainly, we know great horned owls do, and I've seen pictures of a peregrine falcon eating an adult osprey. So ospreys are on the top of the aquatic food chain, but they can be one step down in somebody else's food chain. Ospreys have a gland that removes excess salt from their systems. Do the osprey that live on and eat fresh fish water have the same gland? Yes, all ospreys would have the same glands, and they just ospreys eating fresh fish wouldn't need. They just wouldn't use that gland much. But because when any osprey that's born anywhere could wind up eating saltwater fish or freshwater fish. Well, I suppose if birds nesting near the coast might wind up nesting inland and feeding on freshwater fish, like the birds up in New Hampshire, or the young from a New Hampshire nest might find itself on the coast and eating saltwater fish. Will the chicks be banded this year? We hope so. I will be up on Hog Island from I think the dates of the Raptor Rapture are the 11th through the 15th. Believe that's right, of July. I may be off by a day either way. I think there's at least 1 or 2 vacancies in the camp, so if you don't have plans for that first or the second week in July, come up to the Raptor Rapture session. This will be the 3rd time I've taught it. It's a lot of fun, and if the chicks are in the nest and all goes well, we will certainly ban them. If we don't ban them, those chicks will go, like we did last year, go to a neighboring nest and ban those chicks. And so everybody in the Raptor Rapture can see the young being banded and see them up close and personal. Are there things that you have learned from the viewing of osprey nest cams that have truly surprised you? Any information gathered that hasn't followed prior thinking? There's just been some really cool stuff with that we've learned from the osprey cams. One of the neat things is watching the young actually move nest material around. Sort of nobody thought that the young would do that, but they do seem to move nest material around. One of the cool things I saw on one of the Long Island nests last year that I'd never seen, and I think this was a young male, the adult was a young bird, and he would typically, as you all know, because you've seen it hundreds of times, when Steve brings fish into the nest, the head is usually not on the fish. And that's what I sort of jokingly refer to as his overhead charge. So typically the males they eat the head off the fish, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is when the fish comes into the nest, it's not thrashing around, and so it won't, which could injure small young. Also, the first bits of the head are small, tough to bite and swallow. So if the male takes care of that, the female can get right into the sort of the sides and the fleshy part of the fish, and that's much easier to feed the young. So at one of the nests in the nest in the North Fork of Long Island that was on a cam last year and again is this year, The male would bring fish in, and they were still flopping around. You could tell he just pulled them out of the water. They were still dripping wet, and he'd drop them off, and the female would grab them from him, and then he would get in line and stand there at the edge of the nest, and she would feed the young, and then she'd feed him, and he was begging for food from the female, and no one had seen that behavior before. Sometimes he would take a bite from the female and then pass it on to one of the young, but sometimes he would swallow it himself. So it will be really interesting to watch that nest and see if that same behavior happens. What is it that compels osprey parents to bring potentially dangerous things like plastic bags and other weird stuff to the nest? Ospreys are, and all birds, and they build their nests, one of the things they're looking to do is to insulate the nest. Ospreys, as you know, when they begin the nesting season, it can be pretty cold and windy, and they need to keep the eggs a little bit warm. As we've discussed earlier, they don't keep them very warm. But they do need some insulation under the nest, and so they bring in things like tufts of seaweed and clumps of grass. That sort of thing makes sense, and we have created things in the environment like plastic bags that just sort of fits an osprey's mental picture of things it could put into the nest. And there are all sorts of, no shortage of weird things that we've seen in osprey nests, butterfly nets, and bikini top was one of my favorite. Dolls, shovels, little kids' plastic beach shovels, all sorts of weird. They love lobster bait bags. So all of that is just what would be typical behavior. And before we started putting all these weird plastic things in the environment, most of the things that they brought into the nest would not be dangerous. One of the particularly dangerous things they bring in are tangles of fishing line that have been discarded, and I don't know how many osprey young and adults die because they get tangled up in fishing line. So if you're a fisher person, make sure you take your discarded fishing line away from the shore when you're done fishing. Is it possible that Rachel has a memory of last year's eagle attack, and will she use that to reinforce her protection of her chicks? Don't know. It could be. I think that might have been a bit of a fluke deal with maybe one of the birds was off fishing and far from the nest. That's hard to say, so I don't really have a good answer for that one. Why does the pigmentation of osprey eggs tend to be darker for the first egg and less so for each subsequent egg? Why does it tend to be more concentrated in one area of the egg? It probably has something to do with the glands in the oviduct that produce the pigment that's in the egg. So as the egg passes down the oviduct, it first drops out into the oviduct from the ovary as just the yolk, and the unfertilized egg is on the outside of the yolk, and that's where fertilization takes place. Then that yolk passes down the oviduct, and a series of glands lay down the egg white. Some more glands put down the membranes. Those are the things when you peel a hard-boiled egg while the little pieces stick together. Those are the eggshell membranes, and then glands put down the calcium, the actual form of the shell. That's where DDT messed up ospreys and why their eggshells were too thin back in the DDT era. And then the last thing is sort of the egg gets painted by the glands. And why the first one is darker than the others, maybe, I don't have a good answer for that. Maybe just the bird uses up a lot of the pigment on the first couple of eggs and doesn't have much left. I don't know the physiology of that. Why do osprey chicks have the darker markings around the eye and body stripes at birth when other raptor chicks tend to have white down? Is there a benefit? Probably the benefit is that if they're in the nest, because the nests aren't covered, and I see there's a question coming up about that, the nests are exposed, they're out in the open, and so if you had white downy osprey babies in the nest, they would be very conspicuous against the dark material and that usually is the lining of the nest. So that's all part of the camouflage. As the young get older and they start to grow their body feathers in, veterans of the osprey cams know that the young have a scalloping, sort of a tawny edge to all their contour feathers, which is really a great bit of camouflage when they're lying down doing that pancake playing possum thing in the nest. So that would be the benefit of that. And here's the next question. My 7-year-old grandson wanted me to ask why ospreys build their nests so high up off the ground. Well, they want to get off the ground because they want to get away from predators, like raccoons that are wandering around on the ground. And they also want to get up high, and they want to build them out in the open, which isn't part of this question, but I think it's one coming up, because they want an easy access to the nest in whatever wind conditions there are. Now, ospreys have very long wings. The wingspan of an osprey is upwards of 5 feet. Very long wings that are great for soaring over the water and while they're looking for fish, but they're not good for flying in and out through tree branches. So typically osprey nests are on the very top of a tree, or they love the poles we put up for them, or cell towers especially. There are over 1,000 osprey nests on cell towers in Florida alone. So they like that tall nest out in the open so they can come in to the nest in they can have an upwind landing on the nest no matter where the wind is coming from. It's the same reason that there's more than one runway at most airports, so planes can make upwind landings. Ospreys do the same thing. How can we tell Rachel and Steve apart? This works for most ospreys. The adult females tend to have a fairly dark chest band. Some people call it a necklace. And that males tend to have very little of that dark brown chest markings, or none at all. So 2 ways to tell them apart. If they're standing next to each other, a male is always smaller than a female. So just from a distance, you can see the big one will be the female, and the smaller the male. You see an osprey with a real dark chest, you know it's a female. If you see one that's snow white on the belly and the chest, then you're pretty sure it's a male. But there's some overlap. There are some females that don't have much chest marking, and there's some males that have a bit, so it's not 100% sure, but a real dark chest is a female and a real white chest is a male. So on some osprey nests, the male appears very attentive before hatching and afterwards, while other males don't seem to spend much time at the nest before or after, other than delivering fish, and in some cases leaving with leftover fish. Which, if any, is the norm for males? Probably we really do see a spectrum of male drive for parental care. We see some males that really have a strong drive to incubate the eggs, and you'll see the male and female sometimes getting into a shoving match to see who can incubate the nest, incubate the eggs. Typically, when the male brings the fish in, when the female is on eggs rather, the female will take the fish off and feed on it, and at that time the male usually will get down and incubate the eggs. And some males seem to show very little interest in incubating the eggs. Others seem to have a very strong drive to do that, and when the female comes back, sometimes she has to sort of push the male away to get back on the eggs. I would say that somewhere in the middle range there is that typically the males will take over incubating as soon as the female is gone. To have one that actually fights back when the female wants to come back in to take over the eggs is unusual, and to have the ones that don't want to sit on the eggs at all is also a bit unusual. So somewhere in the middle there is the norm. Do you often see male ospreys brooding newly hatched chicks? We actually are excited to report that our first juvenile osprey that we tagged as a youngster, this was on Martha's Vineyard. His name is Snowy, and we have a picture of him brooding young over on a nest in Nantucket. This is his first nest and the first of any of our young ospreys that we tagged that have made it to breeding season. Is it just a quirk that Steve likes to bring so many sticks with moss to the nest, or is this a normal behavior that most father ospreys show? It's a typical behavior. I think what's going on is that Steve is getting sticks from the coastal Maine, which is so moist and humid that it's probably hard to find a stick that doesn't have moss on it. But the moss does provide some insulation, so mossy sticks are great for nest building. What part of the U.S. is most populated by ospreys? So that's the area around the Chesapeake Bay. There are probably 9,000 pairs of ospreys, according to the preeminent authority on ospreys down there, which is a remarkable number. That's it. Florida, the East Coast, Florida is probably second in terms of the most ospreys. Southern New England has a lot, all the way up through Maine. So coastal eastern U.S., then they're spread out over almost all of the rest of North America. There are now no states where there aren't ospreys at least trying to nest or nesting. So 10 years ago when I did a survey of ospreys nesting across country, there were 4 states in the sort of the middle, the prairie states, that didn't have any ospreys nesting, but now every state has ospreys either trying to nest or actually nesting. Why do ospreys do a tail wag? Does it mean they're happy? Probably not. They do that to sort of settle all the feathers back in place after they may do that, especially after they've been preening. So that little, and sometimes birds will do a complete, what's called a rouse, where they'll do a whole body shake. They'll sort of lift all their contour feathers up and then just do a big shake, and that will sort of shake out odd bits of down and loose feathers that will get away from the bird, and then as the bird's feathers settle back down, they'll all be in place. Any thoughts on the juvie that showed up at Tom and Audrey's nests last year and tried to integrate itself into their nest? They were pretty accepting. Have you seen this behavior before? We have indeed. In fact, that was happening at a nest very close to Tom and Audrey's nest. Tom and Audrey nest in northern Chesapeake Bay, just across the bay from Annapolis. So we were trapping at a nest there, trying to tag the adult male, and we wound up, there were 3 birds at the nest, and one was a young female, adult but young, who was integrating herself into the nest, and we wound up catching her and putting a satellite transmitter on her, and we watched her in the rest of that season explore all over the general area, and finally late in the summer she picked out one area and spent most of August there before she migrated south, and that was where she came back the next year and actually had her first nest. So that is fairly typical. A lot of young ospreys, because there's so many ospreys now, it's hard for young ospreys to find a breeding situation, opportunity. And so we're seeing with the young birds that we've tagged and just observing at nests anywhere, and we'll often see 2 or 3 young, presumably young birds fighting over nests, especially if one of the adults didn't survive the migration cycle. So that's when you tend to find some real, some pretty heated battles going on. It's the fight for succession at a nest plays out. We say that ospreys mate for life, but what I think it's more appropriate to think of this as ospreys bonding to a nest site for life. So because the males and females migrate to different places during the winter, they both come back to this. They'll both come back to the same nest. If one of them doesn't return, that the one that does return will begin. If it's the male, he'll begin courting as soon as he gets back, and the first female that shows up and is interested in his courtship behavior he will begin the process of negotiating a pair bond. If his female comes back a few days later, typically the sort of the resident female will not have much trouble chasing off a young whippersnapper intruder to her place, and the same is true in the other direction. If a male doesn't come back from migration, young males may see the nest site and fight over that nest, and the female from that nest will return, and she'll just sort of go back to her nest and let the boys fight it out to decide which one is going to mate with her. And often this gets so messy that that particular nest pole isn't productive during that particular breeding season. We've seen that happen any number of times on Martha's Vineyard, where we've been following that population for a long time. And this also explains why ospreys, there are osprey nests on Martha's Vineyard that have been occupied since 1970. And it's not the same pair, but there's a sort of a serial replacement has gone on over the years, and there may be, this may be the third or fourth pair of ospreys that have nested on that platform. A word just while we're talking about longevity and how long ospreys can last. The record for an osprey age in the wild is 27 years. There was a female over in Scotland somewhere who lived to be 27, and she raised 50 young during her lifespan, and I think she went through 6 or 7 males. Is it true that most firstborn are female? I do not think so. Do male ospreys ever raise chicks sired by another male? Now, that certainly could happen. It happens in most bird species. There's a lot of fooling around in the bird world, even in birds that we think are monogamous and are mated for life. And studies of songbirds have shown that as much as 30 to 40% of the young songbirds in a nest have DNA that don't match one of the parents. So fooling around in the bird world is pretty common, and I suspect it happens some in ospreys. When we intervene when there's some apparent trouble in the nest, I only recommend intervention if it's something like a bird has been tangled up in fishing line, or if it's or a plastic bag. If there's something that is a man-caused, human-caused problem, then that certainly merits intervention. But I don't believe in intervening when, in the case of the nest down in Cape Cod, where the female was being very aggressive toward her young and not feeding the young, that kind of thing we should not interfere in, and we shouldn't go rescue young that are starving. All of that, nature should just be, we should let nature take its course. And the marvelous thing about these webcams is that we get to see nature in all of its harsh and unforgiving ways. And so sometimes we'll hear people say that nature is cruel. Well, nature's not cruel, because to be cruel, you have to have the intention to be doing harm, and that never happens in nature. To be doing harm just for harm's sake. Obviously, an osprey catching a fish certainly has intentions of harming that fish, but it's for a good reason. So I think of nature as harsh, unforgiving, and often random, but it's certainly not cruel. And I think these nest cams are a prime way of teaching people that that's the way nature works. On the Chesapeake nest, the eggs were left alone in the cold night at 43 degrees. Rachel did so as well for 2.5 hours. Well, will that have any effects on the development of the chicks? And we've covered this in an earlier question. It was actually during the day that I'm pretty sure it was during the day the eggs were left alone for 7 or 8 hours. And so I think 2.5 hours with Rachel is next to nothing for ospreys. I think the effect I think it has on the development of the chicks is that it slows it down a little bit. I don't think results in any problems in the chicks. I think the ospreys have evolved to so that the young embryos developing in the eggs are in the eggs, I think, are tolerant of that chilling. Do you have to get permission to build your own osprey nest? Typically, only if it's out on a wetland. If you're on a marsh where you need permission to do anything out on a marsh. But if it's on your property and you're on high dry ground, you're not in a wetland, you can put up nest platforms and you do not need permission to do that. How long does it take from hatching to flight? How long will the offspring stay near the nest after flight? Typically it's about 8 weeks for hatching to the first flight. And then how long will the young stay around the nest after the first flight? That depends on the individual. I've had birds that we've put satellite tracking devices on leave their nests within a week and not come back. Some of them will, about half of them stay around the nest until they migrate. About a quarter of them will go off and wander around a bit and then come back, and then about a quarter of them will wander off and go settle down somewhere else and then stay there and go on, just start migrating from there. We had one of the birds we tagged in New Hampshire last year. The day after we tagged it, flew 160 miles from New Hampshire down to a nest on Narragansett Bay and took over the nest. It moved in and it excluded the young that were born on that nest from the nest, and for the next 10 days, I think, it was fed by the adults at that nest. Then it flew into some guy wires, I think, and we found it dead, and the young from that nest came back. So that's fairly typical behavior for ospreys that are in a colonial situation when young are nearby, and when there are a lot of nests near each other, the young, just like teenagers, will go raid the fridge at their friend's house. Young ospreys do the same thing. But that was a fascinating observation to see a young osprey take over a nest 160 miles away from its own nest, and it suggests that as young ospreys are wandering around, exploring the world around them in their first flights, that there's sort of a resource they can stop in and be fed at nests wherever they happen to run into one. The parent ospreys don't seem to pay attention to which young they're feeding. They just feed young in their nests. I am afraid I'm going to have to leave. This is it's been a great set of questions, and apparently there are a lot more coming, but I don't have time to spend any more time on the broadcast here. So I will try to go through some of the questions that have accumulated and answer them online. We can maybe post the answers on the website in the chat area. So for now, I'm going to have to sign off, and my guess is I'll do another one of these a little later in the nesting season. Don't forget that if you're interested in coming up to Hog Island for the raptor, the camp, I think there's still spots available, and we'll be doing this in the future. So if you don't want to do it this year or can't do it this year, think about doing it in one of the upcoming years. We've had some good fun with people from the chat community, often who know more about some aspects of osprey biology than I do. So thanks to you all for your attention and your love of ospreys, and for what you're learning and sharing with each other and with me. So we'll see you next time.